You ever open a door in the middle of the night and realize you have no idea who you're letting into your life? That's the question that's haunted me for years. The image of a stranger on the porch, or a quiet face at a card table, or the creak in an attic that makes you realize someone's been living inside your memories. I've spent a lot of time in cabins, weekends away, working alone, cleaning out the place my dad left me. And 3 nights stand out. 3 little stories where ordinary things turned weird, where the wilderness didn't just make you feel small, it made you feel exposed. Quick heads up, these are true. They're messy, unresolved, and they left me with more questions than answers. If you're into real cabin horror, consider subscribing. There's more like this, and I'll tell the rest of these if you want them. For now, listen close. Each of these nights taught me something about how little we really know about people. Story 1. The weekend that should have been fun. We planned that trip as a break. Stacy and I wanted a quiet winter weekend. Nothing fancy. Fireplace, cheap wine, the kind of cabin with prism windows that scatter the orange lamp into weird shapes across the floor. Randy had been single for a minute and said he'd bring a date. He rolled in with Lucy like it was a joke he'd been telling just to see the punchline. She was quiet at first. Very quiet. Pale face, as if she'd come in from a different light, and Randy kept introducing her with that proud, slightly embarrassed grin of a guy who'd met someone and didn't totally know how to brag about it. We started the night playing Uno. You wouldn't think a card game would be the setting for something that sticks with you, but when 4 people are packed into a small living room, low orange lamp, the hum of a small heater, snow pressing against the glass, tiny things feel huge. Lucy took the cards like she'd learned to play the way people learn religious rituals. Precise, polite, but distant, like she wasn't expecting to stay. She watched us. That was the odd thing. She didn't laugh at the jokes. She didn't try to trade silly trash talk. She watched, like she wanted to memorize each face. At one point, someone put down a draw 2 on purpose, the kind of move that gets good-natured grumbles. Randy because he'd be penalized, me because I'm competitive in stupid little ways. Lucy snapped in a way that made the air go thin. She slammed her hand down, and then she shouted, just a single, sharp exhale that filled the room. Eyes wide and bright, voice cold. Seriously? No calm, no pause. For a beat, it felt like an outside noise, like the heater had blown a fuse, and the sound filled the room. Then she slammed her card down again, flipping the deck like she wanted it gone. We laughed it off, the way you do when something goes sideways and you don't know how to name it. Randy muttered something about being tired. Stacy, always good at smoothing things, made a joke to redirect the strange energy. But Lucy's mood didn't bleach out. If anything, she got more intense. She started telling stories, intense, unasked for details about relationships and heartbreak and strange things that didn't add up. She would say something like, I left at 2 in the morning once, and then go into vivid detail about the cold air, but never explain why she'd left. The room would tilt. I felt the hair at the back of my neck stand up. That first night, it was weird, annoying even. We went to bed thinking maybe she was recovering from something that Randy had explained and we'd laugh about it in the morning. But the next night made the first one look like a misread text. Around 2 in the morning, Randy woke up and told me he'd heard something in the living room. He always sleeps like the corpse of an overworked man, so waking him up is rare. I padded down the hall in my socks, and the cabin smelled like someone had mixed lemon oil with cigarette smoke. Sharp and wrong. The prism windows threw a fractured orange onto the snow outside. The living room light was off, but the low glow from a lamp in the kitchen made long, soft shadows. And there she was, Lucy sitting fully clothed on the couch, eyes fixed on Randy, not blinking, not breathing like someone awake should. She wasn't in a sleeping position. She was upright and alert in a way that meant she'd been there for a while. Randy whispered, Lucy? And she didn't answer. Her gaze was steady, like she was watching a quiet animal. Randy, half asleep and embarrassed, moved closer and tapped her shoulder. She didn't react. He tapped again, firmer. She turned to him slowly, without moving anything else. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a flat line. "I see you." The sentence lodged in my throat. That line, 3 words, sounded normal and not normal at the same time. You can say, "I see you," the way friends say, "I hear you," like empathy. Or you can say it like someone who's been watching, really watching. Randy laughed it off again, a nervous little laugh. I told him to go lie down. He did, but he wasn't sleeping after that. He sat in the dark, looking at the ceiling, fingers splayed like he was trying to press his skull flat. We made coffee early. Lucy claimed not to remember much of the night, like a person who removes the weird parts from the story before sharing it. That afternoon she left the cabin for a walk and came back in shorts and a t-shirt, teeth chattering, cheeks red with cold, while the rest of us were layered up in beanies and 2 jackets. That image hit me like a slap. A woman in nothing but summer clothes, stepping out into a white world, as if the winter meant less to her than to us. She said she liked the cold, but she also laughed when I asked if she was okay. The laugh didn't touch her eyes. That evening we argued, like any 4 people living closely do, and Lucy snapped again, but this time Randy wasn't laughing it off. Voices rose. I remember the clack of plastic chairs, the sound of snow brushing down from the roof like a slow shower. At one point, Lucy packed her bag hurriedly and went upstairs to sleep. Randy followed up the stairs and stood in the doorway of the small bedroom, his hands in his pockets, and said something I still replay. "Come on, Lucy. Just open the door already." It was low and mean in a way he'd never sounded before. We heard the bedroom door creak, then silence for a long stretch. Then later, much later, Randy woke up and said he'd found a knife under her bed, not a pocket knife, a large kitchen knife, the kind you use to chop, blade dulled but still heavy. He'd lifted the mattress, and there it was, tucked beneath like a bad secret. We didn't do anything heroic. We were ordinary people who just wanted to be safe. We put the knife on the kitchen table between the bread and a mug of cold coffee and stared at it like a piece of evidence in a household crime show. Lucy didn't wake. We shook our heads and decided the only sane thing was to leave. We packed. We left the light on. I felt ridiculous and terrified at the same time. What if we were overreacting? What if she'd put it there for something innocent? But none of us could get past the image of her sitting in the living room at 2 a.m., watching Randy sleep, or walking into the snow with nothing on but a t-shirt. We drove away with the heater banging and the windows fogged up. Randy didn't speak for most of the ride. At a motel in the next town over, we split up. Stacy and I took one room, Randy took another. I said something weak to Randy about what he thought we should do, and he just shrugged like someone aging 10 years in an instant. The last time I heard from him about Lucy was a week later when he told me he'd stopped answering her calls. He ghosted her, which is the soft way people describe cutting someone out without confrontation. He said it felt wrong to talk to someone who'd been that quiet and then that intense without any explanation. We tried to look into her. I checked the photos on Randy's phone. Nothing. I checked the social handles he'd had saved in his contacts. The names either came up empty or the accounts were thin, like they'd been made last week and left untouched. No profile pictures, no posts. We drove past the place Randy said she might have lived, an apartment block that looked abandoned from the outside. No one answered when we knocked. We tried calling the number she'd given Randy. It rang and then went dead. We asked around. At the time, I wanted to say she was transient. I wanted to put a label on it because labels make us feel like things fit on a shelf. But that wouldn't be honest. There was no record of her in the usual places, no social media presence that matched what Randy had described, no utility records in that name that we could find, no mugshot or news mention that would explain away the unmoored feeling. I don't say she was dangerous. I don't know what the knife was for. I only know that someone's behavior, disorganized, intense, unpredictable, made us feel unsafe, and in a small cabin with no easy exit, we chose the one thing we could do: leave. Months later, Randy tried asking mutual friends if they'd heard from her. No one had. He went through the movements most people do when they lose contact: calling, messaging, leaving voicemails. Nothing. That absence is what keeps gnawing at me. Not a trail. No explanation. Just a hole where a story should be. It's small things that stick: a laugh not reaching a face, a jacket not zipped for winter, a card slammed down like an accusation. We told ourselves a dozen stories to make sense of it. Maybe she'd been off her meds. Maybe she'd recently lost someone. Maybe there were reasons she couldn't stay. Each of those is possible. Each of them also leaves the question open: what does someone look like when they aren't trying to tell you who they are? When I tell people that story now, they usually ask, what happened to the knife? We left it on the motel nightstand while we figured out next steps because we were idiots and scared. Randy said later he'd disposed of it, but he never said where. I don't know. There's no paper trail. And when I ask Randy about Lucy now, he shrugs and says, I don't know who she was. That answer sits inside my chest like a stone. I still see her in places. A woman bumps into me at the grocery store, and for a second I pull back. Not because she looks like Lucy, but because my brain remembers the tilt of a head that watches. Isolation did this to us. It turned one game of Uno into a scenario where we were acutely aware of how little we can know about the people who sit in our living rooms. But that winter weekend was only the start. The cabin had taught me a lesson about how easily a stranger can bend the room's energy into something heavy. I thought after that I'd learned the shape of caution. I thought that keeping my front door locked and the car keys in my pocket would be enough. It wasn't. Microbeat. You get comfortable, then the world nudges you and asks if you're sure you know who you're letting in. Story 2. The Man in the Suit. I'm an introvert by design. Not the cute kind everyone labels quirky, but the real kind. I like rooms with doors that lock. I like long stretches where I don't have to explain myself. So when I say I go to cabins to be alone, I mean it. I picked a place a couple hours away because I wanted the kind of silence that eats conversations, thick, satisfying quiet that lets you think until you're almost tired of it. The cabin had a back porch that hung over the pines, a small wood stove, and prism windows that cut the late light into shards. It was the kind of solitude you plan for. No Netflix, little phone service, just books and snow. I hiked one afternoon, and the woods were that thing that makes you feel both calm and watched, leaves and branches whispering, the occasional snap underfoot. On the way back I heard something odd. Deliberate snaps, like someone walking quietly and breaking small branches on purpose. When you're alone, you imagine the worst and the best at the same time. I stopped, listened. The sound didn't come again. I chalked it up to deer or a fox, then kept walking, making sure to stomp louder on purpose so any nearby animal knew I was there. That night settled in the way the kind of nights in cabins do. The wood stove popped and hissed. A low orange lamp threw a circle on the rug, and I read until the pages blurred. The wind had an attitude, pushing at the windows like it wanted inside, and when it hit the prism glass, it made a soft humming echo across the room. I was halfway into a chapter, the house feeling small and safe, when something knocked. It wasn't a small knock. It was on the front door, slow and patient at first. Knocking at a cabin door when you're alone is always instinctively a wrongness. You think anyone who shows up at that hour is either lost or has poor boundaries. I went to the window and peered through the frost toward the porch. Standing there was a man in a suit in the middle of deep snow at night. Clean cut, like he'd stepped out of a different life. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't dripping wet. There was a small, calm smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knocked again, louder. He looked at the door like he'd been expected. "Hello?" I called, a stupid, high-sounding voice that my own ears did not like. He tilted his head slightly and said, "I'm sorry, I'm lost. Could I come in for a minute? I just need to warm up." There's a torrent of possible reactions in that moment. You can be the person who flips open the door and invites strangers in. You can be the person who phones it into the local sheriff, the kind of person who will holler and make a scene. For me, it's always been a calculus of safety versus courage. That night I did the safe thing at first. I kept the deadbolt on, cracked a window only a few inches, and spoke through it. "You should be careful out here," I said. "Where did you come from?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned very slightly against the frame of the door, watching me like someone studying a photograph. "I thought this would be a good place to stop," he said. "Do you live here?" I didn't tell him I was alone. That felt like giving him a weapon. "No," I said instead, "this is private property." He smiled again, and it was the same measured smile. "It looks very quiet here." His breath fogged the little crack of window. "You're Victor, aren't you?" There was no way he should have known my name. I hadn't told anyone where I was that day. I didn't shout my name to the pines. The last time I'd said where I was going was to Stacy, and she was in town, hours away. My hands went cold. "No," I said too fast. "How do you know that?" He blinked once, like a person who's interrupted a thought. "I remember the name. I've seen it somewhere. I thought it fit this place." He laughed, the kind of half-laugh someone makes when they're trying to appear casual. Then he tapped the door again, an almost polite reminder. "Could you let me warm up? I won't be long." Something about the way he said it was wrong. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged. I felt smaller, like the house might lean into him and share its secrets. I kept the deadbolt on and said no firmly, then added that I'd call someone if he didn't leave. He shrugged. "Of course." He stepped back from the door, hands in his pockets like the whole world was ordinary. I locked every bolt I had and sat down with my back to the door. My phone showed 2 bars, painfully inadequate. I called the non-emergency line and heard a long recorded voice telling me to hold. The man at the door began walking away on the porch. Once he was out of sight, I felt the skin on my neck relax a fraction. A half-hour later there was laughter. Not a hysterical kind, not a laugh of surprise, just a low, almost casual chuckle that rolled across the front of the cabin. It made the walls feel thinner. I peered through the window and saw no one. The porch light swung in the wind, making cozy little circles of orange on the step. When the deputies finally did arrive, eventually someone had come. There was no one on site, and the snow around the porch was flattened in a few strange, purposeful prints. Later, an officer would tell me the tires on my truck had been slashed sometime after I'd left for a quick walk that afternoon. Likely the same person who'd been around the place, but that was after. At that moment, I sat in the dark and wondered how the man had known my name. The thing that bothered me wasn't the slashed tires. It wasn't even the interrupted solitude. It was that he knew something I didn't want to explain to anyone, that the door, my place, had a label, that someone could read it and decide what they wanted to do with it. Here's another part I still can't make peace with. When the man spoke my name through the crack in the door, for a second the world rearranged. You think you know the shape of your personal boundaries, your name, your address, your habits, and then someone uses your name like a key. It opens something that wasn't shut properly. It makes you feel oddly pinned. After that night, I didn't sleep well in cabins for a long time. I started checking the perimeter before nightfall. I'd sit with my back to the stove and imagine knocks that never came. The rational part of me said he was lost. Maybe he was. Maybe someone lost in the woods would come up in a suit because that's what they were wearing at work that day, or because it was the only thing they had clean. But there are these small details, like his deliberate snapping in the woods earlier, that didn't match the picture of a disoriented traveler. I didn't want to call him dangerous. I didn't want to label him with anything definitive. All I had was a moment, a name whispered through a crack in a door, and the shape of tires fallen under someone else's fingers. If the first story had been about the unpredictability of people in close quarters, this second night was about how strangers can find you even when you're trying not to be found. Microbeat. The woods teach you one of two lessons. They'll keep secrets or they'll reveal them. Sometimes they do both. I want to tell you what happened after the deputies came, the slashed tires, the drive to a hotel, but that's for later. There's something I haven't told anyone, something small that made the hair on my arms stand up in ways the slashed tires couldn't. When the man leaned toward the glass to say my name, there was a faint sound beneath his breath, like someone humming the same 3 notes over and over. It was almost a tune, and it felt off, like a radio not quite tuned right. I only heard it once, but I've hummed it in my sleep since, like a tune you can't place. The man left that night, but the memory didn't go with him. The next morning, I found the back gate latch bent outward, as if someone had tried to lift it without the right leverage. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know why he called me by name. I only know how small the world felt after that. A single sound, a single name, and a stranger's presence turning my safe place into potential prey. And for someone who likes being alone, that was unnerving in a way I hadn't anticipated. But the stories don't end there. There's a third night, the one that came after my dad died, and I went to clean out his cabin. That one feels like a violation. Closer to home, closer to memory, and it's the kind that sits beneath your skin for a very long time. The first 2 taught me about the foreignness of other people. The third taught me about how close danger can get when you assume the past is empty. I drove up to my father's place with a truck full of boxes and false confidence. The cabin smelled like my childhood for the first few minutes. Old blankets, the faint smell of cedar, a spice of something I couldn't name. Then, as I opened the back door and stepped in, a smell hit me that rearranged everything. A wet, rotten odor like something had been left wrapped in plastic for too long. It wasn't just bad, it was patient bad. It had settled into the rafters and seemed to occupy corners with a sense of ownership. I thought immediately that something had died. An animal, maybe. But the smell was too human, too lived in. The attic hatch was warped. The little ladder creaked when I climbed it. The roof had prism windows that threw slashes of dust into the dimness. You could see where someone had been living if you looked for it. Cigarette butts in an empty can, a pile of wrappers, a blanket folded like it was a territory marker. The mattress I remembered in the guest room had indentations like someone had been sleeping there a while. I felt like I was intruding on a long, quiet guest who'd gone uninvited. At night I heard sounds, the rustle of movement above the ceiling, a soft settling that could be the house or could be footsteps. I don't have the appetite for confrontation when I'm by myself, especially not in a place that holds my father's things and therefore contains sharp, private pieces of me. The rational option is to call the police and let them clear it. The practical option is to let professionals do their job. Instead, I decided to check the space myself because I thought, stupidly, that I could prove to myself I wasn't afraid. I lay awake for a long time, and then, sometime after midnight, I noticed the blanket in the corner of the living room was moving. I told myself it was the heater. I told myself the wind was messing with the threadbare edge. The movement stopped and started, like a small animal, and then it shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. A lump under a blanket, like someone breathing shallow. I called out softly, "Hello?" And the blanket stilled. The house returned to the kind of silence that sounds thin and threatened, the kind where your ears start inventing things. Then a smell, closer than before, that same patient rotten scent, rolled down the stairs. I heard the blanket rustle, and the shadow of the figure bolted for the back door with a speed that made the wood floorboards sing. I ran after him and slipped in the doorway because my foot caught on a rug. He lurched into the grey outside and did something like a stumble, like someone who hadn't been outside in a while and forgot how cold proper air could be. His coat was patched and hanging off him, his hair mangy in the kind of way that screams of months without care. He looked at me with a blankness that had nothing to do with surprise. It was as if he'd been caught doing something routine and unremarkable. He ran off into the tree line and disappeared in the kind of way that makes you question whether you really saw anything at all. When the police did come, because this time I did call them, they told me it was probably a squatter. They used that word like a fact. They said people sometimes slip into old cabins and live in them for months, surviving on trash and the odd thing they could salvage. They took photographs, wrote up a statement, and said they'd keep an eye on the area. The man they described from my words was someone who had been there a while. Evidence of longer-term habitation, cans, soot, the smell, pointed that way. They suggested I leave the rest to the property management and not sleep there alone. I didn't go back inside after that. I locked the door and drove away like I was burning a bridge. Years later, I sold the cabin without ever returning to the rooms where my father had once sat, as if that would somehow keep the memory of being invaded at bay. But it didn't. In the nights after, I'd wake up and imagine blankets shifting and tiny, patient sounds. Each of those 3 nights, Lucy at the card table, the man in the suit, the squatter in my dad's attic, left its own kind of scar. They taught me that normal people can be unpredictable, that strangers can know things they shouldn't, and that the past can be occupied by people you don't expect. I still don't have tidy endings for any of them. Lucy disappeared from our lives with no trace. The man in the suit laughed on my porch and called my name. The attic occupant bolted into the trees, and the cabin sold with that smell still hovering in my memory. I'll tell you more. How Randy tried to look Lucy up, exactly what the police wrote in their report about the suit guy, what the property manager found when they cleared out the attic, but that's for the next part. For now, let the shape sit in your head. A card slammed down, a knock at the window, a blanket that breathes. Have you ever had the feeling that someone you barely know was not who they seemed? Share those stories in the comments if you've been to cabins or if someone ever knocked on your door and called your name. I'll be back with the rest. What the police actually found, what Randy did next, the small details that don't look like much until you spend the night wondering if you were the only person awake to hear them. About Lucy. Randy kept poking at the edges of that absence until it felt like he might bleed out from the question. He didn't go to police, not at first. He told me later he felt ridiculous filing a missing person report for someone he'd known a few weeks. Instead, he did the quieter, more desperate things people do now. He checked every number she'd ever texted from his phone, scrolled through contacts at 2 a.m. like a man trying to find the seam where the world might open up. And he drove by the places she'd mentioned as where I used to crash or where I used to work until they didn't look like anything to him anymore. He called the number she'd given him. It rang and then stopped. He left voicemails that sounded too small and embarrassed, the kind of messages you leave when your throat tightens and you want to sound casual. He messaged mutual friends, people who knew her for 5 minutes at parties, and got replies that ranged from who to silence. Once, late and drunk in the kind of way that makes you confess things you usually hide, he went to the address he'd been told, one of those grey, low-rise apartment buildings, and knocked until a light finally came on inside. A woman answered and told him, gently and with that immediate privacy people use for strangers, that no one by that name lived there. Randy stood in the cold and looked at the wall of mailboxes the way someone looks at a puzzle missing a piece. It's the not knowing that sticks. Randy told me he slept with his phone on his chest for a week, feeling foolish and exposed, like the phone could ring and deliver the answer or the threat. He tried to talk himself into a theory that she was transient, that she'd made a bad choice, that people online sometimes aren't who they say, but the facts didn't line up into a neat box. There was the knife under the bed. There was the image of her in the living room at 2 a.m., like a statue. There was the shorts and t-shirt in the snow. Those things felt like data you couldn't fold into a comforting narrative. Months later, he admitted trying one more thing. He scrolled through old photographs on his own phone, looking at faces to see if anything clicked. A woman at a bar, another at a show, nothing that matched Lucy's pale, too bright stare. He told me he'd finally accepted that the person he'd dated for a weekend, if that's what this even was, might never be someone he could track down, and that acceptance landed with the weight of grief. Not for her, not exactly, for the loss of a simple truth, that you can know the people who share your space. Randy never accused her of anything. He just stopped answering her calls. He didn't write her off with anger. He wrote her off with a thin, careful fear. That same careful fear is what I handed to the deputies the night the man in the suit knocked. I told them what I could remember. The snaps in the woods, the suit, the way he leaned against the doorframe like a person who'd been told it was his, and they took it down in a neat, perfunctory way. Their tone was efficient. Their faces were the faces of people who've seen 1,000 small wrongnesses. The official report said, in the language everyone expects from police notes, that an unknown male in a suit was observed in the area and that the reporting party believed their tires had been slashed. It recorded the slashed tires as damage to property and listed no suspect. They asked if I wanted to press for further investigation. I remember saying yes, because something about answering the question felt like a mending stitch, and then I said no, because the idea of sitting in a station and answering more questions while someone else's name was written in their books felt like inviting storylines you couldn't finish. The deputies did check the perimeter and make sure I wasn't being followed. One of them drove me to a motel because they said it was better I sleep there that night. He told me the squad would keep an eye on the area. That was the last concrete action I remember. The polite, human motion of someone treating you like you were temporary and fixable. There was a small, mundane cruelty to the aftermath. Insurance forms. A call from the tow yard telling me they'd keep my damaged tires until I could arrange a replacement. A follow-up call from one of the deputies asking if anything else suspicious had happened. The humming tune the man had made, those 3 muffled notes at the edge of speech, stuck to the inside of my skull like song stuck in a throat. I hummed it at odd times and felt the muscles in my neck pull tight. People joked about me being paranoid. They didn't mean anything malicious. They genuinely wanted me to stop getting squeezed by small anxieties. But that didn't lessen how the world had altered its geometry and how a name spoken through a crack in a door had rearranged my sense of safety. And then the attic. When I told the property manager I wanted to sell my father's cabin, he offered to clear the place out and make it presentable. I thought of him as a formality, a bureaucratic kindness. Then he called and told me to come by because they'd found, well, he didn't say squatters at first. He said, there's evidence someone's been staying over. His voice was careful. That's the voice people use when they don't want to make you more afraid. When I stood in that attic for the second time, this time with the manager and 2 men in work gloves, the smell hit me harder than the first day. It had settled into a texture, the damp of someone's clothes. Cigarette smoke that had mixed with the old cedar into a scent that was both domestic and wrong, the faint, persistent note of someone cooking food on a tiny hot plate. They showed me a stack of things they'd bagged, nesting wrappers, a dented can with a label I couldn't read, a frayed blanket compressed into what was obviously a bed. They took pictures and logged it like an inventory. Blanket, bedding, used batteries, empty packets, candles. They found a small, rusted spoon, an old lighter, and a stack of newspapers folded into a corner that looked like they'd been used as padding. What bothered me most wasn't the stuff. It was the intimacy. Whoever had lived up there had left traces that suggested habit. Cigarette butts wadded into an empty tin. A little char on the underside of a wooden board where someone had burned a wick to warm a cup. Indentations in a foam pad that matched the size of a shoulder. The property manager told me, politely, that it looked like someone had been using the cabin regularly for months, that these things don't appear overnight. He also told me they didn't find any ID or any consistent clue. No mail, no paperwork, no names scrawled on the walls. That absence felt like the echo of the other absences. Lucy, the suit man, and like a question that had slipped out of reach. Police came again, took statements. They said the formal term was unauthorized occupant. They noted in their report that because there were no signs of recent assault or theft beyond the intrusion, the case would likely be closed unless more evidence came up. That phrasing, likely closed, had a finality that hurt. I wanted a harder line, a clear end, arrested, charged, explained. Instead, I got an administrative tick box that allowed the system to move on. The house had been violated, and the authorities had made a note. Human life, with its messy edges, had been restitched with a seam most people can ignore. When they cleared the attic, they found a little shelf hidden behind a box, and on that shelf was something that didn't belong to the squatter, and that made me sick in my stomach. An old photograph curled at the edges, with my father in it. He had the same crooked smile he used to make when a joke landed, and behind him was the cabin porch, years younger. The photo was almost certainly left from my father's time, but the fact that it had been moved from its frame and tucked behind someone's sleeping bit, felt like theft of memory. The manager apologized, genuinely, and said it might have been used as a sort of talisman. Maybe the squatter rummaged through boxes and found an old picture and kept it for the warmth of a remembered face. Maybe they weren't thinking in the way I would. I didn't want to make any assumptions. I only knew that to find my father's face tucked away in a stranger's hidden shelf felt like a violation of a different order, a theft of quiet. I sold the cabin. I hired someone to board it up, to haul the old life away, and I signed the papers with a hand that shook not with age, but with a small private exhaustion. People asked if I regretted it. I said it was what my father would have wanted. He'd never liked houses he couldn't tend, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to sleep in a place that had been lived in by an unnamed person, while my father's things were still within reach. The sale closed, and I never cross-checked the new owner's name. Those are the logistical follow-ups. What I want to be honest about, the part I don't see on paper, is how this small stack of incidents changed the way I leave my keys at night and how I answer the door. After Lucy, after the suit man called my name, after the attic breathing beneath my feet, I developed a nervous ritual. I check the latches twice, sometimes 3 times, and I list the number of locks in my head like a mantra. When someone knocks now, my first thought is not hospitality, but inventory. How many exits do I have? Is the phone charged? Who knows I'm here? That's a sad little truth to carry, because it means parts of you that were flexible become rigid. There were other small changes. I stopped inviting people I barely knew into private spaces. I learned to trust the prickle at the back of my neck more than I trusted the convenience of being polite. I kept a small canister of pepper spray in the kitchen drawer and a flashlight by the front door. When I drove to a cabin now, I told someone exactly where I'd be and when I'd be back. Simple things that feel like common sense, but that, in the moment, feel like preparation for a reality you hope not to meet. But I also learned something else, quieter and worse. There isn't a clean way to categorize people. The man who hummed those 3 notes could be lost. He could be harmless. He could be someone who believed the woods were a place to be. Or he could be someone who had been watching cabins for a long time, learning which doors had soft locks and which names were easy to find. Lucy could have been a transient soul trying to belong for a weekend and flailing. She could have been someone with reasons none of us had access to. The squatter could have been a person whose life had narrowed to sleeping in odd places. They could have been criminals. They could have been sinners. They could have been people who were doing the only thing they could to survive. The absence of tidy answers is part of the pain. What remains, though, is an emotional geography I can map. There are parts of human behavior that look like red flags. Lapses in personal continuity, inconsistent stories, intense attention that quickly becomes watchful. There are also ordinary missteps, forgetting to zip a jacket, telling a strange anecdote at the wrong time, that have nothing to do with malice. That ambiguity is its own predator. It feeds on the way we try to make sense of strangers. I don't tell these stories to make anyone paranoid. I tell them because they taught me how quickly small things can escalate when you are isolated, and how little the face in front of you might reveal. They taught me to pay attention. They taught me the value of small, practical precautions, share locations, lock doors, trust instincts. There's a lingering detail that follows me more than anything else. It's not the slashed tires, not the knife, not even the smell in the attic. It's the way names can be used like keys. Lucy's flat, I see you. The man at the door saying, Victor. The sense that people can choose with a word or a look to cross into the rooms we imagine as ours alone. I have friends who say this is the price of living with people, an element of unpredictability. They're right. But there's a particular terror to unpredictability when you're alone by a prism window, and the night is doing its work on the edges of sound. Sometimes I imagine a library of small missing things. The knives we forget to put away, the names we stop answering, the beds that someone else sleeps in when we think the place is empty. Those little absences accrete into a kind of weather. You learn to move around it. If you've ever had an encounter like any of these, someone you can't place in a photograph, a knock that felt wrong, a place you returned to and found had been lived in, tell it in the comments. I read everyone. It's not that I want more fear. It's that I want to fold our stories together so these flares of unease feel less alone. These 3 nights, the card table with Lucy, the knock from a man with a suit, the blanket moving in my father's attic, don't wrap up neatly. They didn't give me answers. They gave me questions. Who are the people we let into our lives, and how do we protect the rooms we love? They taught me that the wilderness is indifferent, and that ordinary appearances can hide sharp edges. So if you live out of town like I do, if you like the shape of quiet and the feel of prism, light on a floor at night, take one small precaution for me. Lock the deadbolt and tell someone where you're going. It's not dramatic advice. It's not a cure. It's just a small practical thing that might keep the humming out of the door. Thanks for listening to these 3 stories from a lonely cabin. If any of them hit close to home, share your own story down below. What you heard on a cold night, what knocked on your door, or the time someone turned out to be not what you thought. If you want more true encounters like this, like or share the video so I know to keep telling them. Either way, take care out there. The woods hold a lot of people, some of them harmless, some of them lost, and some of them very quietly, dangerously unknown.